Welcome to Something to Talk About from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. We're going to be talking politics with David Harrison in just a minute. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the ancestral homeland of the people of the clear salt water, the Suquamish people, who have lived on these waters since time immemorial, and the lands that live right beside them. We honor them and are learning from their stewardship. And we also want to thank Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island, which is a sponsor of Something to Talk About. They offer assisted independent living and memory care up on Rolling Bay. They have a beautiful campus there. They have respite care and day stay programs as well. And right now, if you are interested, you can drop by for a free lunch. Just call Celia or Jamie. 206-594-1010, or check out the website at fieldstonecommunities.com. And David, thank you very much for joining us again. There's a lot to talk about in the world of politics. As the former lecturer of the Evans School and founder of the Policy Center at the University of Washington, you have the credentials to get us going. And I know you do a lot of homework looking at this before you show up and share your wisdom.
It's nice to see a couple new faces. I'm delighted to do it. For those of you who don't know, I also have a blog, our unfinished work, so you can follow me there as well. I'm trying to figure out how not to loom so large on the screen, but I'll figure it out.
No, that's my fault. I'll get rid of. I'll shrink you in a minute here.
Here we go. So as is my custom, I'll announce our three topics. I'll stop after each one. Don't hesitate to break in. Cynthia Schick, I was trash talking you before you could hear, saying that we have to be on our best behavior now that you as a veteran organizer are joining us. I'm talking about Trump's legal issues, which of course are the number one issue before us at this particular moment. I want to go over the Senate races. We haven't done that for a long time. It's very, very, very interesting. And thirdly, I want to talk about the votes that Joe Biden doesn't presently have, that he did have in 2020, and that those of us who support his candidacy hope that he will get back or get. First, I want to do a little sidebar about what's different than forever. Ever since there have been elected officials, this is true, I've done a lot of study of Madison, there have been recriminations and ways to try and reduce the influence of people who have taken an opposing position in a way that the elected official finds unacceptable. No one has come close to how Donald Trump does recriminations, especially within his own party. What's different? Well, lots of times if a member says something you don't like, you have a relatively modest capacity to achieve your goals of decreasing their influence or even defeating them at the polls. Donald Trump's ability to do that is not only monumental, it's proven. And if you're an elected official who would like to remain an elected official, it's scary. So we as commentators sit over there and say, why doesn't Marco Rubio or Lindsey Graham or somebody say something we know they believe? A good example would be there's hardly a Republican that is a bigger defender of the integrity of the judicial system than John Kennedy.
We just lost your audio a little bit there. I don't know did you put something over your microphone or?
I didn't do anything. Can you hear me now?
That's much better. Much better.
There's hardly anybody in the Senate who's a bigger defender of the criminal justice system than John Kennedy, senator from Louisiana, Republican senator. And Trump's going around saying that was a rigged verdict. There's no way in the world Tom Tillis and John Kennedy of the Judiciary Committee feel that. They just feel that if they were to say that, it would not be appreciated and vindication would be suffered upon them. So the first thing is he's been successful at doing that. The Republicans who voted for impeachment are falling one by one. Dan Newhouse of Eastern Washington is one of two survivors. And the second thing is he has a broader scope of of uh, of who he's going to take revenge against. He can't get Jeff Sessions out of his head 8 years after Jeff Sessions appointed a special counsel. Jeff Sessions was the first senator to ever endorse Trump, so that doesn't count. Same for Bob Good, who's the member right now that who has endorsed Trump, but Trump is trying to defeat because Bob Good temporarily supported Ron DeSantis. Even though DeSantis has been allowed to genuflect and return to the flock, that doesn't mean that members that endorsed him are free from recrimination. So that is different, very different than back when I was in DC for many years. And the second thing that means is, so if you wake up in the morning and you're supporting the D's and you have sort of a existential dread about the fact that Trump wasn't disqualified by the insurrection or things like that, then one of the reasons you have that dread is it seems like nobody in his party is a check upon him, not even, say, Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski. But the reason they're not a check on him is that they're not they're not infallible, and they like to continue to serve in office. So the story they tell themselves is, well, I don't agree that Joe Biden called Alvin Bragg and made all this happen, or called the 12 jurors or whatever, but I'm not going to say anything. And so that, to this day, is the reason why the only Republicans who would say anything would be people that Trump can't touch. There's going to be a big example of that coming up, because pretty soon after January 6th, John Thune, who's Mitch's deputy in the Senate, said the election wasn't rigged. He said that in mid-January, which of course was 2 months after which he should have said it, but 4 years earlier than Trump wanted him to say it, or 100 years. And he'll be running. Mitch's will be in the Senate, as you know, and John Thune will be running to be minority or majority leader against Rick Scott. And you watch, Trump will endorse Scott because Scott would never have said the election was legitimate. So that's just a little sidebar. Just remember, one of the reasons that you might feel this anxiety is that it seems like the whole world is parroting on that side of the world, and they are. Just also remember, this is very interesting. It certainly is the last hurrah for Biden, who's 81. No chance he'd be running in 85. And we will be lucky to have him be healthy all 4 years. It's the last hurrah for running for Trump again. If he loses in November, he's not going to run 4 years from now for the fourth time. And that time they wouldn't let him. And in the meantime, of course, he's got, even if they push him back till after the election, he has enormous legal problems. Remember, whoever a potential heir apparent in MAGA is, they don't own a TV station like he does, like Fox. Fox isn't going to lay itself bare before any DeSantis or anyone else. And Republicans will be split, even MAGA Republicans. So the chance that we'll see someone in our lifetimes who has that much control over 35% or so of the electorate is zero, I think. So on to the legal issues. Any questions or thoughts before we move on to that meditation? On the legal cases, as you know, the sentencing is in July for the 34 felonies. There was all sorts of discussion polls before the verdict was announced as to how it would affect the vote in November. And any pundit who said it's too early to say, of course, is right. You never know what other big issue will intervene. But what ended up getting polled subsequently is pretty close to what you would have guessed when people 4 months ago said, when polling said 25% of independents and 10% of Republicans would take a felony conviction into account. I think that's probably what has happened. And you're getting, I think, pretty clearly on the front side of it, a 2% kick for Biden, which is smaller than choice, Roe v. Wade being overturned, but still significant in a close election, especially in swing states. The thing to remember is Biden's ahead with people who voted in 2020. Biden's ahead with people who almost always vote. What puts Biden in more trouble is irregular, infrequent voters who pull toward Trump. And it's the hope of the Democrats that in addition to that 2% kick, they'll also get a kick of people who won't vote at all. And the Trump conviction will help them decide not to vote. So Biden's people would be pretty happy with that so far. Obviously, as you know, there's something else that they hope will happen. And on this screen, I have said it might. And that is, the pundits say that there's hardly any chance that anything else will happen in court between now and November other than Trump's sentencing, which seems almost certainly to not include jail time because of the class of felony it is. Falsification of business records, even in the service of another felony, would not necessarily be eligible for big jail time. So there's that in July. It's also good to remember TV especially always loves to say, of course, this will be appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. But of course, that's not the way appeals work. You have to have reversible error. There's not going to be reversible error in Merchan's unwillingness to change the venue or in Merchan's jury instructions, except for one issue, and that is the novel approach by Alvin Bragg to tie falsification of business records to election law and therefore change a misdemeanor to a felony. If you're, say, Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court, you might think that was just a little too novel, but you might not see it because there's two appellate levels in New York even before there would be a Supreme Court appeal. And Mike Johnson saying Supreme Court should step in right now. They're not crazy. They're not going to do that. They're not going to have even their upcoming ruling on immunity touch upon this case. For one thing, the facts of the case are that the felony occurred before Trump was president. So even if led by Alito, you take a broad view of what a newly invented presidential immunity for official acts looks like, this wouldn't be one of those acts because it was committed. Most of it was committed, except for the writing of certain checks, was committed before Trump was sort of elected in 2016. So at any rate, it'd be a long time before two levels of appellate courts in New York upheld the Bragg conviction, and then the Supreme Court would be very unlikely to take this case. So what is happening between now and November is much less than we predicted on this screen 8 months ago in terms of the emergence of cases. You'll get the final exhaustion of E. Jean Carroll appeals and Trump's an upholding of the Trump's need to pay her $90 million, for which there's already a bond. And then the other civil penalty in the overvaluation of property case is down to 250 million or so, and you'll get an upholding of those in due time, upholding of those of that case, and that won't be taken by the Supreme Court either. And then you'll get Fani Willis dead in the water for the reason that has been in literature since we have had the printed word, having to do with people who are smitten with each other in multiple ways and therefore willing to give Trump a pass in the state of Georgia. I myself don't know what the conflict of interest would be for Fani Willis to hire her love to prosecute the case, since they're both have the same positions. You're not buying them off. But I don't know how that would be disqualifying, but we'll find out from the appellate court, but certainly after November. Leaving one just huge issue, and that is what the Supreme Court is going to do in this very month. A lot of pundits have said there is no chance that Judge Chutkan in the Washington, D.C. federal court will be litigating a Jack Smith January 6th charge during that period. I don't think that's certain at all. And as you know, that whole argument has to do with what Amy Coney Barrett said during questioning. And so I'll go over that. We mentioned it before. So the argument is that if you have to figure out what the difference is between an official act of a president and a private act of a president, that the Supreme Court, even though there's no mention of it in the Constitution, might decide to declare that anything is an official act that is taken under the powers and constitutional statutory responsibilities of a president is immune from prosecution, or except maybe through impeachment processes or subsequent to impeachment processes. And if they do that, they're not going to create an immunity for a president or former president based upon private actions that are not official acts. So Amy Coney Barrett, whose turn was 8th, asked 3 questions of the defense about whether they would acknowledge that certain acts are outside of an immunity protection for official acts. And she asked these 3 questions. Is it a private act to willingly and knowingly spread false claims about election fraud? If you knew it was a false claim, like the claim in Wisconsin or Michigan, that more people voted than were in Detroit, and you knew that wasn't true, would it be a private action if you were president and said so? And the defense said yes, that would be private. We're not acknowledging or agreeing with prosecutors' stipulation of the facts, but it would be a private act if those facts were proven. Then she says, is it a private act to falsely petition the government or court to overturn based upon false allegations? And defense counsel said yes, same answer. And then, is it a private action if you falsely submit electors based upon those false allegations? And yet again, so in all 3 cases, the defense attorney admitted that those were private actions. What she's going for is, okay, then that's outside any immunity protection. So that's the theory that Amy Coney Barrett is seeking at least a 5th vote. There might be multiple opinions on various aspects from Roberts, or I guess maybe from Kavanaugh or Gorsuch, mostly from Roberts. then if you buy all that as what's happening in the court, then you'd have to buy, well, what would happen? So point A, what would happen is you remand the case to Judge Chutkan and subsequently to the appellate court, who upheld Judge Chutkan, and you make them redefine what they said was no immunity, and you make them sort out which charges that Jack Smith has are private and which are official, and then you adjudicate that. If you did that, of course, it would take you the rest of the year and there would be no trial. It's possible, some people think it's possible, that they would let Chutkan move forward in September with a trial based upon private acts. And some people think that's why Jack Smith asked the question in the first place, because he can litigate, he could try Trump on those limited grounds. He doesn't have to have anything that anybody thinks is an official act. So that's the story. If you're hoping for something, if you're on that persuasion, you're hoping the court will let Chutkan go ahead in September. Or absent that, you're hoping to have a ruling that makes Trump responsible under the Constitution. Questions, thoughts, or concerns about the legal front? You're uncommonly silent. Even the usual wise Tom Kilbane is not saying a word. No questions?
I
You
have a
just all
comment
know
that
this.
I have a comment that goes back a little bit to your idea of how the trials are affecting the polls
Yeah.
and likely voters. The other element that you didn't mention in that are any changes to the electoral processes in any of the battleground states. Is that a risk that's going to be continuing to overshadow how it all plays out in November?
Are you referring to Nebraska and Maine, or what are you?
Yeah, I'm just looking at there. I know there have been efforts to try to restrict or change voting and
Oh, I see. You're talking about just somebody's invitation to exercise their franchise and vote. I think it's the usual wars. For those of you who would like to follow the wars in terms of absent mail voting and who qualifies and what kind of ID and all that stuff, that's the Brennan Center at NYU in a nutshell. They're outstanding. ACLU is good too, and I could send you links. I think there's less of a chance that it's now June of anything that we don't. There's been voter suppression efforts. The courts waffling a little bit on the redistricting issues in the South, but still with all their waffle, there'll be a couple more Democratic seats in the South based upon the Voting Rights Act. Other than that, I think there's a possible attempt to intimidate where there'll be the recruitment of poll watchers that might keep somebody from feeling that they should vote. But as some of you know, there was partly due to COVID, there was a massive increase at home voting and laws that supported that voting between 2016 and 2020. And that's why if you were rooting for Biden, you were sitting there looking at those Pennsylvania results where he was 80,000 votes behind, but there were 500,000 votes that were the vote by mail, and you felt pretty good. What's happened this time is Trump. There is a Republican campaign now to do vote by mail. Whereas in 2000, even in the Warnock race in January, Trump was still saying it was all a fraud and actually decreased his own vote that way. They're not going to do that this time. In Nebraska and Maine, Nebraska was fooling around with the possibility that the two electors that they split between congressional districts, they would just have that be state total. And then the Maine legislature says, if you do that, we'll do that too. So it'll reverse the impact. They were trying to pick up a vote for Trump in Nebraska, and Maine said, if you do that, we'll pick up the other side in Maine. So I don't think anything's going to happen. Sheila.
What about the idea that in Colorado as well as here in Washington, they're going to try to keep Trump off the ballot because of his felony?
Well, the Secretary of State here has already said they're not going to do that, so I wouldn't be surprised.
In either place?
Well, it won't matter because, I mean, it would matter because there'd be a furor about it, but it wouldn't matter in terms of electoral votes because Biden will win Colorado and Washington anyway. But you wouldn't want that to, now that the Supreme Court's done its thing, I think you would want that to be left alone. Other questions or thought on the legal side before we go to the senators? Tom?
I want to redeem myself.
Um,
The Republican echo chamber, scares me in that it's created enough confusion that people, the average voter looking at this, what's out there in the media, they're just going to get tired and say, I don't know what's right. Who do you believe? And I think it's going to cause people to not vote, at least, lose the excitement like you had when Obama ran, or, the last time that Biden ran. I just feel people are getting turned off by it. You don't know what's right and what's not.
well, I think that's exacerbated by a not inconsiderable number of electors who would prefer that neither of these candidates be the nominee. That's why I wanted us to go next generation, and why I think Nikki Haley was right when she said the first party that goes next generation is going to win. It's not a common thing. It's first time. The combined age of these guys is far above any combined age we've ever, like when Reagan ran in his 70s, Mondale was 60 or something. So I think that's a bigger issue. Parenthetically and perversely, I think voter discontent, because we're ahead with voters who voted in 2020, might not be such an awful thing for us. I'll say at the end when I say what people Biden needs to get, but obviously you want their likely discontented voters to stay away and Biden's to find themselves. And I'll talk about that a little bit, but I do think with social media being what it is, I think we're going to be in a swirl maybe forever. The issue is disintermediation. So now everybody's an expert and nobody's a liar. But guess what? There are experts and there are liars. It's just harder to sort them out. No Walter Cronkite to say, and he wasn't so infallible either. But yeah, I think we have a little bit of disaffection by Biden supporters or thin Biden supporters, but I do think that he thinks that Trump will help him with that. I think Biden feels that Trump will say enough things about recrimination and throwing Biden in jail that it will help in the long run and it'll drive voters back to Biden. We'll see. I think is a big question mark there is how Biden does in the June debate. Anything else on this front before we go to senators? It's an interesting story. As some of you know, there's 34 people running for Senate and 22 Democrats hold 22 of those seats. So just happens that 2018 was a good year for Democrats. Trump had been president for 2 years, and that's when Democrats went back to the Senate. So they had to defend all these seats in a little bit less propitious year. And if you look at the 12 Republican seats, you could argue that none of them are vulnerable. The two biggest possibilities are Rick Scott in Florida and and your favorite Republican Ted Cruz in Texas, who's running against a congressman who's a Vietnam War veteran and who otherwise should win, but Texas is pretty red by now. And even though Beto O'Rourke only lost by 2 or 3 votes when he ran against Cruz, anyway, you could probably count those as no-go. The only thing I would say is keep in mind both cannabis and abortion are on the ballot in Florida. And you'd have to beat Rick Scott, but there's a new Fox News poll. There hasn't been a lot of polling in Florida that has Trump only ahead of Biden by 4 points in Florida post-conviction. That's very interesting. I wouldn't have thought it. But right now I'm saying we don't have a take-back opportunity. As you know, there's 51 people in the Democratic caucus, including independents, and 49 Republicans. So they don't need Kamala Harris to break a tie. And if they lost one seat and it was 50-50 and Biden and Harris won, you'd still have the majority. Schumer would still be majority leader, and they could do the same kind of reconciliation bills that they did with Manchin. However, they're already going to lose one because Manchin's not running, and Jim Justice, who's running in West Virginia as a Republican, and he's going to win by 80 million votes. So that means you can't lose anything else unless you're going to take back Florida and Texas. So you look at those races and you think, we can't do that. We'd have to win 7 races, if we were Democrats. So it turns out that's possible. So the Cook Report, which is very respected, thinks these Democrats are likely winners. Ruben Gallego in the open seat, the cinema seat in Arizona, Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, and the successor to Stabenow in Michigan, whose name is Alyssa Slotkin, who's the congresswoman from where I grew up, Lansing. So there's a thought that those folks are all going to win, which would leave you having to win 3 races, and you're already seeing one of them on the TV. The race in Montana is John Tester versus a guy named Tim Sheehy, who won the primary, was endorsed by Trump, and has a good vet record, which is good in Montana, but has the disadvantage of having 2 stories, separate stories of how he got shot. So this is what you're going to see. You don't get that very often. I can't remember a Senate candidate having 2 separate stories about how they got shot. He says that he was wounded by friendly fire in Vietnam and didn't want to report it because it would get people in trouble. But he was in Yellowstone with his kids, and the ranger reported a gunshot wound. He said he hadn't wounded himself then, that somehow the bullet got dislodged, and that's how he ended up at the hospital with a wound. The ranger said that he had a gunshot wound, which would mean that he lied about the Vietnam wound. So that John Tester will. That you'll see ads about that for sure. John Tester would have to win for Democrats to maintain their majority. And then the other 2 seats are these. One is Sherrod Brown, Mr. Kilbane's place. And the polls show Sherrod Brown, back when Tim Ryan tried to win the other seat against J.D. Vance, a lot of people thought, well, this is a masquerade of a Sherrod Brown race, but it isn't. At least doesn't look like it. It looks like Sherrod Brown's 5 or 6 points ahead. And that would be Ohio voters having been with rumpled Mr. Brown so long that they just decided that he's part of the fabric, and he's done enough constituent work, and the choice last fall brought out some more Democrats in Ohio. So, or it could just be that Bernie Moreno, his opponent, just doesn't have enough juice. He's the owner of luxury auto dealerships, which isn't a great profile. And then the third race is Jackie Rosen in Nevada, and she's significantly ahead of Sam Brown, who's also a vet. Interestingly, a very severely wounded vet, which is an act of courage to be out there. He was very severely burned, but he ran and lost last time again in the primary, so she's ahead. So you could see a possibility that Democrats will win all 7, which would get you back to 50-50 and would allow them to keep the Senate as well as the presidency. So that could happen. It really depends a lot on the presidential race, who votes, whether somebody stubs their toe. Remember, there was a candidate 2 or 4 years ago in North Carolina who was supposed to win until they disclosed 7 affairs or something like that. So you never know what's going to happen between now and November, but it's surprisingly close. House will be close too. Some of you have heard me talk about the generic vote. Very close. Democrats are a little ahead. So even with the malperformance of Mike Johnson's House, it'll be close. But if you care about that, you'd want to watch Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, what happens in the primary, because it's not just Joe Kent running against her. It's a moderate Republican who I would think would have a better chance of beating her than Joe Kent. So you might want to root for Joe Kent, but that would be, I think, the only close race here. I don't think there's a serious run after Kim Schreier. There's a great primary right here in our district, Emily Randall and Hillary Franz. So that's it on the Senate. Questions, thoughts, concerns, insights?
So what do you think about the Randall Franz?
I don't know what to think. I ended up, when people asked me, I ended up just assuming that since Derek Kilmer wanted Hillary to win, that Hillary would win. But since then, a number of people, electeds, have endorsed Emily Randall, who's got a good legislative record. Remember, she's got a free run. She stays in the state Senate if she loses because she's in the middle of a 4-year term. I did get a chance to talk to an elected about why Derek Kilmer resigned, and he said, all family.
It's all family.
That's what
It is family.
my elected friend said, that it's all family. On the local front, Christine Rolfes has no opposition. So if you were thinking of emptying your piggy bank for Christine, don't. Other questions? Yes, Sheila.
What about if you're going to go local? How about Greg Nance and Gwen
Well,
Brian-
I don't
Brian
follow that,
Felix.
even though I
Felix?
was a candidate in that district 24 years ago and lost by a very small amount of votes. I think my guess is that those races have been seeded. Those are CEDED. Those are Democratic seats. I don't know that there's a viable Republican candidate for any of those races. This has to do with a woman who beat me and Christine Rolfes eventually beat 4 years later, was Beverly Woods. And she was a colleague of, she was actually a moderate. She voted for the transportation package, and they executed her after that. That's one of the reasons why Christine, who was a Bainbridge City Council member, was able to beat her. The party went toward the right from there, and that's why they're not fielding viable candidates in the 23rd. And the demographics have changed too. Other questions about races? Yes.
It seems to me like maybe the case of reclaiming the House for the Democrats has gotten weaker based just paying attention to what your recommendation, what your thoughts have been over the last few months. Is that because although there's not a lot getting done, uh, there's not as much chaos in Mike Johnson's Congress?
Well, they went, so around the start of the year, even though they had kicked out McCarthy, the generic vote was like plus 1.5 for Republicans. That's a pollster says, which party are you voting for in the congressional races? And because of distribution, we have to have like +2 to win the House because we have so many concentrated Democrats. So then that went to about +1, +1.5 Democrat, and it's starting to go back toward even. If those are real results, these are pretty small numbers. It would be because they finally passed a Ukraine bill, I think. I don't think every time Marjorie Taylor Greene does some awful thing that it necessarily drains Republican votes for the Republican Congress people in other districts. I think it'll be very interesting. I think it's probably because in California and New York, they lost 8 or so Democratic seats that they could have won inexplicably. I would guess that the Democrats, certainly if Joe Biden wins by 40 electoral votes and 3 million popular votes, I think they'll slip by and control the House by very few votes. Remember, I noted it's a whole different thing if you control the House by a little and the president is on your side. Mike Johnson's problem is he doesn't have any way to corral his members. All he can get them is a preferred place in a vote on the floor on legislation that is going nowhere because Schumer won't pass it and Biden won't sign it. So he's got limited bargaining power. And the reason he's still speaker is they don't have anybody else to elect speaker. And they know that's stupid. And they'll let him cut a budget deal in September again, because they agree with him that they'll lose the House in November if they close down the government. So that's why these things are happening. They'll let their Marjorie Taylor Greene's, Matt Gaetz's trash Mike Johnson as long as that's all they do. It's just kabuki theater. Anything else on the Senate? So my last little note is what votes is Biden not? What votes are is Biden? Who isn't planning to vote for Biden? Who Biden would like to have vote for them? Much is being made. Let's go category by category. Biden did very well with independents, especially suburban women 4 years ago. He's still doing well with them over choice, and they don't like felons. So that isn't his biggest problem. If he's got a problem over there, it's because when you say the word economy, they think inflation, and they just don't think inflation. They think inflation from 2 years ago. So that's pretty tough. There's a wonderful analysis of what they thought at that time about Trump's record on the economy, which they thought was lousy. And it's only now that people are discovering that 4 years ago it was wonderful, or 5. So that's independence. You just want the Supreme Court to do something, and you want Trump to have a good debate, and you want Biden to have a good debate. You want Trump to continue to be scary, and you'll get your independence. Latinos and African Americans, there's a thought that that's weariness with Biden and age and the economy you'd want to continue to work on the economic message, and you then would want to quote real things that Donald Trump has said about Latinos and African Americans. That's always a good strategy, the truth, and that's what you would do. The thing that's drawn the most attention is the best single cohort that Biden had last time was people aged 18 to 30. It's been delivering 70%, and it's not delivering in polls anywhere near 70%. Some of that is an RFK deal. They're not, some of us think RFK is unthinkable because some of us could have been killed dead as a doornail by COVID. So we don't like it when somebody pretends it was a hoax, because it wasn't. Some of us know people who died. It's hard to forget that. But young people being a little less vulnerable to COVID, there's some votes over there for Kennedy. If they got to go somewhere, that's where you want them to go. Biden is counting on two things. It would be absurd for a young person to vote for Trump over being mad at Biden over Israel and Gaza, because Trump is a Bibi apologist and will give Bibi anything he wants, and would deport, says he would deport Colombia protesters to Colombia. Anyway, what Biden wants is a peace deal. He wants a ceasefire that lasts. He wants by November to Gaza to be on the way to rebuild. He wants the peace to hold. And if the peace holds, some of those young voters will come back. And he will say that it was him. And it actually will have been him, because I think the evidence is pretty significant that Bibi's going to stay there forever if he wants to, without the international community acting. And Biden's the one that's sending them weapons, the U.S. is. So I think that's what to do with the youth vote. The rest of the thing to do with the youth vote, of course, is scare them with what Trump is saying about deportation and recrimination and prosecution. And that's I think was a major factor in the last 2 weeks of the election in 2020, and it will be again. I would remind you as I close that there's really three things that are going to happen beyond people thinking what they're going to think about the economy and what happens with Gaza and some kind of ceasefire, which may be imminent. It sort of seems imminent until Bibi makes another statement. I understand why Israel went into Gaza. I mean, we started a war in Afghanistan after the World Trade Center. I understand how these things happen. Three things. The debate is in June, late June. The good news is the ground rules are in a TV studio with no live audience, and the moderator controls the mic. That will, I think, lowering the cacophony is more helpful to Biden than to Trump. I think if Biden is allowed to say what he's capable of saying, then that format is the best possible format for him. Trump agreed to it, I think, to get a debate that early. We're at risk because, Joe can have lapses, but he's a veteran. I think he can do that. The second thing is Trump's VP selection. I don't know how any of these people will necessarily help him at the ballot box. I guess on points I'd rather have it be Rubio, just because I know for certain that Rubio still recognizes that there is actually a constitution. I think he does. Vance probably does too. He hasn't mentioned it lately, but he could. I don't see where the governor of North Dakota gets him anywhere. He I just don't know what he's gonna do, but he could do something that's a slip on a banana peel. He's not gonna be able to do anything that advances him greatly because that person doesn't exist. Unless it's Nikki Haley, and he's not gonna do that. So the third thing, of course, is back to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court comes back and lets Chutkan be unleashed, then that will affect the election as well. So I think we're in a balance. I'm for people who are activists to stop talking about existential dread and start talking about where they're doing postcards, donations, doorbelling. I'm back to having an election. And if we can move forward with this one successfully, the election of 2028 will be new generations of proven elected officials, which will be nice. Questions, thoughts, statements, concerns? You okay with all that? Pretty quiet today. Vicky, you
Tom,
okay?
Tom had a comment earlier. I don't know if it was related to this or
I
something
didn't
else.
see it. It's in chat.
I did have another comment. I heard, one of the pundits talking about how the Biden's negatives on the economy were not affecting the Senate races. The Democrat candidates for Senate didn't seem to be picking that up, which is good. But did you read that or hear that?
I didn't, but it makes sense when you're thinking if Trump and Biden are relatively even in Nevada and Jackie Rosen's 6 points ahead, and Trump and Biden are close to even in Arizona, Gallego's ahead, then that could absolutely be it. Another thing to remember about those two states is choices on the ballot, as it is in Florida. So that's intentional and very good in terms of defending those two seats. But I think you're right, Tom, that it could be, I think that the Democrats had pent up demand, and we're just out of COVID. Supply chains were in such great shape, and I think they influenced the rate of inflation. Larry Summers thinks that it's too late to do anything about it, and I don't know what they would have done then. They were going to pass, major climate legislation, infrastructure, child tax credit. So if those were inflationary, they might have done it anyway. But I think a little bit more care could have been shown, because it's not a made up story. You see it in the grocery market, in the grocery store. Other thoughts? Next time we're on together, the Mariners should be 8 games out in front. You watch. So,
Can you hear me?
when you get right down to it, Sheila, who's president is more important than who's in the World Series.
It is more important. What's more important, Mariners winning or Biden winning?
Yes.
Both.
I was just mentioning one is a game.
Difficult, David.
One is
I thought you were my
sporting
friend.
event. One is entertainment. The other is
Yeah.
it's
for
the
sure.
state of the nation. Good to
That's
see
the
all
problem.
you folks.
We can't always tell the difference. Unfortunately, that's something that we need to get over right quick.
Well, I think part of it is the pundits. I mean, if
I
it wasn't
had a comment I would like to make. After seeing Vladimir Zelensky get down on his haunches, hugging the veteran and talking to him, it looked like he had tears in his eyes when he was talking to them. Did you all see that?
yes,
That was the most, I wept. It was absolutely the most amazing thing. What a wonderful man. Wow.
it's nice. It's good to remember that there are true and genuine stories of human courage. And back in the early days of World War II, when Harry Hopkins went back to meet with Churchill, they didn't know what FDR was going to do. And he put it in a toast he basically said, we're by your side. And Churchill started crying.
Yep.
For good reason. So that's what's going to happen. We're not going to let Putin march into Kyiv. So that's the way whatever we have to do to keep it from happening, that's what's going to happen.
Please.
Thank you, David. Thank you again this month.
Can I make one comment before we leave?
Yeah,
I'm Charles Levitsky, and I just might mention that I am following the Middle East very closely. I read the Haaretz newspaper, which is one of the oldest paper in Israel, daily, and watch the Amy Goodman show and have many other sources. So if anybody's interested in getting any information or interacting, I'd be happy to talk with you.
Sounds great.
and we'll be talking with you next, David, I think on the 12th of July. We're not going to try to meet on the 5th. We'll all be still celebrating Independence Day or recovering from that or whatever. So thank you.
Okay. See you. Thank you.